Well, hi everybody. Thanks for dialing in, allowing me to present today. And so I hope you're having a good day, and you can see the agenda on the screen in front of you. So let's go ahead and get started. Just a little overview of what we're going to be talking about. Just kind of a touch base in how the world is going. It's an interesting thing. Half the jobs lost in the 2008 recession were management jobs, and 3/4 of the jobs created since are low-skill paying jobs. So interestingly, inflation and productivity is low, and wages are better than economists would expect. A lot of that is because of states raising their state minimum wages. So if you're creating the low-skill paying jobs, but at the same time you're increasing the federal minimum wage, then it looks like people are making more. And so that does, in an extent, create some upward pressure. And then I think I have some slides following here about that because of the fact that they just raised the salary exempt level, then, which hadn't been raised since 2004 and needed to be raised, plus there's that upward pressure again, then it looks like people are making more money. But nobody has to tell you that when you think, well, it doesn't seem like it. So wages are better than economists would expect is the short answer to all that. But today, even traditionally low-skilled jobs need skills. You know, post hole diggers. When I was a kid, they had a post hole digger. Let's just say it was really good exercise. And now you need to know how to run one. So you don't necessarily need the brute strength. You need to know how to run one. And the problem is many employees have very low skills. The literacy levels in the United States are just absolutely shocking. And I worry because I think, what kind of life are you going to have with a literacy level that low? A friend of mine years ago used to, around the holidays, I wouldn't have much to do. And so she talked me into going down and grading these tests that the kids have to take to graduate high school. And I thought, well, I work at home, I'll get out, I'll get to meet some people. No, it was really boring. You just sat in front of a computer and you didn't get to talk to anybody. I didn't last very long. But I thought when I started out, when they gave me a class, I thought I was grading second grade. I was actually grading the exit exams for high school, and I was just horrified. So it actually did support what one of my professors said a long time ago, that there's at least 1/4 of the population, and I think that's higher now, that is just basically illiterate in some type of literacy, reading, writing, what have you. So technology is replacing people, not just because technology is getting better, but because people can't do that which technology requires. And so I don't have to talk to you about global competition. It's going to be very interesting to see what effect this, I don't know how to say it, I call it a coronavirus, which sounds like it's something you catch off of beer. Although in my particular state you should be more worried about the flu, quite frankly, but it's going to be not just horrifying, but it's going to be, from an economist standpoint, interesting to see how that affects global competition. And, we read all the time on the internet Silicon Valley stories about I'm starving to death on $100,000 a year. Well, those just don't apply to most people. And so even most people in the Bay Area, those stories don't apply to them. And you can see, I go out there quite often, and I tell my friends, I'm like, you'll see people that work at Walgreens sleeping in the parking lot, and they look just like you and me. They got a car just like you do, and they look just like you and me, and they have to sleep in the parking lot of their employer. So Silicon Valley stories don't apply to a lot of people. Healthcare costs, well, that's one thing you can count on. The world's getting ready to stop turning, I always say, if the insurance companies stop making money. So your healthcare costs are going to only increase. And there's this idea that some people are trading flexibility and lifestyle for money, and that is true to some extent. I guess I do that to some point. We have our bloggers, that are making money from traveling the world, but the reality is that the gig economy is usually just somebody just cobbling together 2 or 3 low-wage jobs to get along. And there are always hot spots and hot jobs, and those change faster now than they used to. So there's going to be an increased use of contractors, and when you see an increase, there, you see states getting into the are you a contractor or employer business, and you can see that out in California because that's the most employee-friendly state there is. But you can also see that in other states, and that's not only because they're worried about contractors. That's because they're worried about getting all the payroll taxes that they want into their coffers. And if you've got kids, there's only going to be STEM skills are becoming more and more prized. They're more necessary, and we already talked about that literacy thing, which includes math. The idea of one-size-fits-all pay increases are going away. And so when we talk about variable pay, we're even getting to the point where variable pay is predictive modeling. Predictive modeling, not just, on things like, well, what would be the profit off this project or this group of employees even, not just jobs, but groups of people. And so variable pay, which is pay that goes up or down with business results, however you decide to pay it, that's the whole idea of variable pay, is becoming a budget line item and should be, quite frankly, and should have been, its own to start with, because base wages, which we're going to talk about first, are wages that don't go up or down. I use $10 an hour for anything because we can all do math on $10 an hour in our head. And, it's $10 an hour no matter what. But variable pay, if I don't produce, I don't get it. And so hot jobs changing faster. Another area we're seeing with state laws, well, actually two areas. The first is transparency in wages, and then even more so, efforts by states, and they have all different methods of doing this, but trying to combat systemic wage discrimination, mainly amongst the sexes, but in California even amongst the races. Because the idea being that if you always, if the job pays 12 and you make 10, then you're always getting paid on what the last job paid you, then you're always going to be behind your whole life, more than likely. And so that's an interesting. I'm all for that. So these are just some slides I left in just in case maybe somehow you've been on vacation in Tahiti for the last several months and you didn't notice that the Department of Labor changed the salary level. Now there's three things. Now the Fair Labor Standards Act has three purposes: federal minimum wage, and states can often pay higher ones. In fact, even localities can pay higher ones. The second is record keeping, and the third is the overtime issue. So to be exempt from the overtime requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act is a three-part analysis. Those three parts are do you meet one of the exemptive duty tests? The second part is, are you paid on a salary basis, meaning no deductions? It's what they call free and clear. No deductions are made for quantity or quality of work. And let me go sideways here for a minute and say, it's not a deduction if you're paying somebody vacation pay. A deduction means they don't get it. So, paid on a salary basis, free and clear, no deductions for quantity or quality. And the last is the salary level. You have to be paid the salary level. And the salary level is set by law. And so it hadn't gone up since 2004. And so now it's went up. And went up for what they call the highly compensated employees as well. And so some interesting changes there. And so I just left these slides in, just like I said, in case you've been in, it's February, in case you've been in Tahiti for quite a long time. And so these were the things that you could do. You could either increase the employee's salary to the new level to maintain exemption, or you could keep the salary the same and pay overtime. But remembering, of course, that that's a non-exempt employee, that you can pay a non-exempt employee a salary, but if they work overtime, you still have to pay them the overtime. Or you could eliminate overtime hours, which honestly, if you could have, you probably would have done that already, because overtime's expensive. And then my favorite choice here, I'm being sarcastic, is to increase reduce the employee's salary or change the employee to hourly at a lower rate, which keeps the total earnings the same after overtime is paid. Yeah, wouldn't you love that if somebody did that? We're going to pay you less and you're going to work just as much overtime and you're going to make what you did before. Oh yeah, if that was me, I'd either quit or I'd start forming a union. And then once I got a union in there, then I'd quit. Because who would like to have that done to them? So, just some things. One of the things to realize is when they increase the salary level or they increase the state minimum wages, then what happens is the employer, it's not just wages, there's benefits, but there's also payroll taxes. So when you hear all this money's getting pumped into the economy, well, some of it's from payroll taxes. That's a lot of money when you start adding it up, a huge infusion of cash into the economy, both into the public coffers and you're getting paid more, people buying more new cars. So then the effect on the economy can be inflation, which if you remember from high school, too many dollars chasing too few goods. Deflation being just the opposite of it. I was an economics minor. It's one of the few things I remember. But it was a good minor for teaching how to view things in its entirety. Because like I always tell people, when one line goes up, it's not just the one line. So you got more money, you've got more money, more dollars chasing less goods. And then what happens to wages when we have some inflation? So inflation's been relatively low. So it's an interesting thing going on right now. And so if you only buy payroll data every other year, I would suggest, which is a bad idea anyway, I would suggest you start buying it every year for the next couple years, because it didn't really hit so much on 2020 wages, but a couple years down the line, you're going to start to see some of the things that I've been talking about. All right, so that's my crystal ball, be that as it may. So let's talk about base wages first, but before that, we're going to talk about what is total rewards. This is from the gurus of compensation and benefits, the World at Work people made this definition of what is total rewards, made up of base rate compensation. So we're going to talk about the two elements that make that up. Benefits, remembering, I always think of benefits as the chocolate chips and the cookies. Without them, there's no satisfaction, but they don't have a dollar for dollar payoff to every person. So if you have a bunch of triathletes, they'd probably rather have help with their student loans than gold-plated health care, especially if they're young triathletes. They can differentiate you as an employer of a choice, and they can retain employees, but retaining employees does not have a dollar for dollar payoff in performance. In fact, it doesn't even sometimes have any. Just look at our federal government. People, it's a huge employer. People work there a long time, and so it doesn't always have, retention doesn't always equal performance. And in a lot of companies, being there a long time, there's what I call 20 years of experience 1 year over, or 1 year of experience 20 times over, or 20 years of experience. If you're an airline pilot, a lawyer, or a plumber, 20 years of experience is a good thing to have. And so my plumber, not only is he a plumber, his dad was a plumber. So, I like that. You want 20 years of experience in your airline pilot. But at the same time, if you're a bank teller, even though that's a harder job to do than you think, they have to learn more than you think. And I would never do it. I spent almost 20 years in banking. There isn't any way on earth I'd stand behind a teller line. You never know who's coming in the door. That scares me to death. But you generally learn everything in 1 year. I mean, it's just pretty much 1 year, 20 times over. And there's what we call the work life, gyms, luncheons, flexibility. Does your boss like you? Do you have fun with your coworkers? Can you bring your dog to work? Those types of things. And they can make a huge difference. Bringing your dogs to work started out in Silicon Valley in the 80s because the first tech boom, they were trying to find ways to retain employees. And if you could bring your dog to work, then that was, worth quite a bit of money. You weren't so eligible to be picked off by a competitor. And then I suppose there's that other, flip side to it that you don't have to go home Do you remember that TV show Veep? The guy's always going home to feed the dog, but I can't stay late, I've got to walk the dog. But everybody's like, you don't have a dog. Like a fake dog gets him out of work. So if you have your dog there, then you don't have to run home and feed it or walk it, right? You can work longer. All right, so the idea of compensation philosophy is, are you rewarding what you want to reward? So what are you rewarding versus what do you want to reward? And there in between lies where your improvement. And so these are some questions to ask yourself. What functions do you want variable pay to perform? What changes in pay structure? I think I missed a slide here. Oops. Hit the wrong button. Wait. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I did miss a slide. Yeah, because this is important. So today, we don't just have that base pay, benefits, work-life triangle. We have variable pay. Remember, one of the most important things to do is define terms when you're talking about anything. And so when you're talking about variable pay, you don't want to be talking about bonuses and incentives and variable pay all in one big stew, because everything gets confusing. So variable pay defined as those things which go up or down with changes in business results. And then you can pay it however you want. And generally, you will pay in one of two types. You will pay some type of incentive, like a commission, and that's usually paid in what people call either commission check, or sometimes in what people will call a bonus check, which will, when we're talking about this car sale that I've got set up later on, that's what will happen. Or performance pay, which is what you generally see in your merit increase budget, which is coming up here. And so performance pay generally goes for, you might not have as much of a dollar for dollar payoff. That's just good job incentive, and it's for those types of departments which are cost centers. And incentives are, things like commission, are for your revenue centers. And so your revenue centers are productions or sales. That's really the only two departments that are a revenue center. Everybody else, HR, even finance, IT, research and development, customer service, all of those are cost centers. Now, if your business is IT, then you have salespeople who sell the IT, and the IT actually is your production. But at the same time, you even still have cost center employees on the back end that support all that, and those are cost center employees. So, what functions do you want that variable pay to perform? And, what do you want differences in pay structure? And, what's the extent to which employee benefits should pay into the mix, which is a completely different analysis. And then where do you want to be in the market? If $10 is our midpoint, then 97% to 103% is considered in the market. And so those percentages are called comp ratios. Or some people like to call them compa ratios, but I call them comp ratios. Everybody I know calls them comp ratios. And so comp ratios are just the percentage of the midpoint. All right, so part-time or full-time, it shouldn't matter. If you're paying people below the market, there should be a reason. If you're paying people above the market, there should be a reason. But base pay is compensation, as we said before, that doesn't vary regardless of performance or results. And most companies strive to pay the overall company to be somewhere within that market rate. Some will decide to pay over. And, but if you're paying under, then if the whole company's under, well, let's just say the best thing that's going to happen is you're not going to have the pick of the puppies, right? And when you start to consider the cost of turnover, which is an interesting analysis, because for the higher paying jobs, turnover is not just 1.5 times, it's up to 500% times the salary of the person who left, because of the extent of the decisions that they can make and the things the latitude that they have and how they can affect your company. All right, so what do you want to reward for base rate? What do you want to reward? Time. Most obviously that would be a union workforce where everything is based on seniority. Your wages, your opportunity to be promoted, your shifts, everything based on time. Knowledge. If you're a college, or if you're an engineering firm, you're willing to pay people who have a PE certification more, because of the fact that you can bid on more expensive projects, and those projects will pay more, and you might not even be able to bid on some projects if you don't have those PEs on it. So you're willing to pay for it. Volume, sales, a car lot would be a great example of this. If you're good at sales, then you can put a couple kids through college. If you're not, you're going to starve to death. And that's because they have what's called almost an offset base rate, meaning that you can end up making a lot more than that job would pay if you're good at sales, but if you're not going to sell any cars, you'd be better off going to work at Lowe's or something, because it's going to pay less than Lowe's. But you don't have that opportunity to make a ton of money if you sell a bunch of lumber at Lowe's, do you? I don't know how Lowe's pays, but so performance. Just always have to make those disclaimers. Performance. My brother used to work for a well-known, probably the best-known tech company, and he used to call that forced curve. Like if you have 10 employees, you've got 6 that are in the middle, 2 that are at the front, and 2 that are behind. My brother used to call that just stay in front of the dog behind you, meaning you just don't want to be down on the bottom. I thought it was a good name for it, actually. All right, so components of the base wage are $10 an hour. Money that doesn't go up or down, regardless of performance, is made up of these 2 things, internal equity and external equity. And the things that I didn't tell you at the very beginning you have to stop thinking about are that you can't think about your own money when you do other people's wages. It'll just drive you crazy and you'll make bad decisions. The other thing that you need to think about is that we're a free market economy. Firefighters don't make as much as, Super Bowl football players do, but we're a free market economy. Should they be prized more? I don't know. I'm not in charge of the world, but I do know we're in a free market economy. And so you have to keep these things. And you also have to keep the idea that when we're talking about internal equity, which is just the ranking of jobs' values in relation to each other, it has nothing to do with the value of the person. In fact, that's the third thing you need to think about. Money has nothing to do with the value of the person. I know some of the nicest people I've ever met don't make very much at all, and then people I know that make a lot, I wouldn't want to meet them in a dark alley somewhere if money was involved. So it has nothing to do with the value of the people. And when we start ranking internal equity, we have to remember that we're just trying to figure out the value of the job to the company. So at that point, it has nothing to do with the person who's in the job or their performance or their longevity. We're just trying to determine the job's value to the organization first. And if we don't do that right, it won't matter how good a data you have and how good you are with numbers, you're going to make bad decisions. So, because if we don't know the job's value to us, we don't know to what to compare the job when we go out with our data, so we have to have some type of system to rank, and the most common is the point factor ranking system. We use 8 to 10 factors. These translate out into points. Those are cut into grades. And then we get our numbers, which is called pricing the job or external equity. And so basically we're going out and we're saying, okay, for this job's value to us, what is the price of labor in the market for which we are competing for people? And so if we're competing for people like a CEO on a national stage, you got to price it on a national stage. If you're hiring bank tellers, you're generally going to go by zip code differentials. And if we're doing tellers, we zip code differentials, but we're also not just looking at banks and credit unions. We're looking at things like some of these fancy really nice pawn and cash checking places and the big box, because we're looking for cash handling jobs is what we're looking at there. Then you're like, but where can I put in individual recognition? When you're done with all that, you look at the person and you go, okay, this is its value, this is the data, where do I want to put them? Where do I want to put them? Because now we've got a minimum, a mid, and a max. And remember, 97 to 103% of that midpoint is in the market. So where do I want to put this person? And these are common compensable point factors. There should be a line of sight with the job description or something's off there. Strategic impact is usually double weighted. You want to make sure you're using the right ranking factors So for example, physical effort in office jobs, we don't rank that. But if you're somebody who's like a lineman, which is an interesting job, right? Because they still call that a lineman, which is, we've changed everything else, flight attendants, firefighters, but linemen are still called linemen. And so that job's got, they're people who like turn your electricity back on in storms. And so obviously there's a lot of physical effort out in some bad environments. And since it's electricity in bad environments, there's safety. So they need that. But in a bank, we don't rank safety and physical factors. I know you said, well, what about, you said you want to stand behind a teller line. Well, that's into safety and OSHA and training and all that kind of. We can make a bank safer. All right, so these are some common compensable factors. Notice there's a definition for what is experience. And if you can be CEO, you can learn it in 15 years. All right, interpersonal skills. You start getting to the higher levels, you're being paid for your ability to motivate and influence others both inside and outside the organization. And I just threw these in here so you could kind of like, maybe you've never seen these before. A lot of people have never seen these, something like this, the back end of a compensation before. But notice, each factor has a description of how we're going to use it, and then definitions of how you apply that degree. And so when we've done this to every job, then we are translated into points. Those are cut into grades. And so we look at something like this, and I want to draw your attention to third and fourth up from the bottom, the Vice President of Service and the Project Director. And so then you go through and you look and you're like, okay, why is my Vice President of Service 3 grades below my Project Director? Something's wrong. One of them's too high or one of them's too low. Well, that's both happening here. My Vice President of Service is too low, and managerial responsibility, I can tell you right off, it's too low in managerial responsibility, and my project director his boss must have really liked him or her because they're ranked way too high there. Their experience is too high. Their managerial responsibility is too high. Their interpersonal skills, their mental process, their organizational impact. It's like almost everything on the project director is too high. The Vice President of Service should be up there in the grade 18, even maybe 19, and the project director should be more down in a 15, or maybe even a 14. All right, so let's talk about, you heard all these things in statistics classes, right? So let's talk about numbers, data. The only really way to get good data is to buy it. And I hate to tell you that because they package it up so that you have a broad range of data, comparative samples, appropriate sample size, a couple geographic differentials. Because if you're just calling down the street, then you don't have a broad range of data, you don't have a comparative sample, you don't have an appropriate sample size. And if you have unions and you're calling the plant across across the city, they might accuse you of collusion, that you're trying to set wages. It's an interesting thing. Their jobs are influenced by the cost of living, but they don't directly follow it. Hence the I'm starving to death on $100,000 in San Francisco. So San Francisco jobs do pay higher, but they don't directly follow the cost of living. Really, if you're in IT, you ought to go to Austin. Cost of living's lower, IT pays more, and the price for IT is increasing faster than what they pay in the Bay Area. Mark my words, Austin's going to be the next tech boom. So when an employee comes to you with their I don't get paid enough.com survey, that's what I jokingly call them, you have to consider, what is the data that they used here. So if I come to you from Peoria, Illinois and say, I'm not making as much as I should, first, those job titles might not be the same. It's not what job titles are not dispositive, as the Department of Labor calls it, for exempt versus non-exempt analysis. They're not dispositive, meaning that one person's director of maintenance could be somebody else's janitor. And then you have to think, okay, well, what's in this sample size? You know, how much is in this sample size, and where is the sample size from? Because Chicago, which isn't even close to Peoria, Illinois, pays a lot more than Peoria. In fact, the suburbs of Chicago pay often more than Chicago, and the Loop, that little part down in the what they call the Loop in Chicago downtown, it pays more than Chicago. But once again, the suburbs can pay even more than the Loop does. So there are differences even in Chicago. And then we look at the Bakken oil fields out there out west. And I had some people years ago I met in Utah that were kind of like their company was at the beginning of that whole thing. And you know, they were amazing to talk about how they were. It was like a San Francisco gold rush, but it was in a different place and it was with oil. And so since there weren't a lot of people out there, you could go out there and make $26, you know, at Walmart as a cashier, which you're not making that in Peoria. So you know, there can be a lot of different things. It could be economics. It could be your job. It could be the price of living in paradise. Of course, that's not Chicago in the winter, that's for sure. So they're influenced by that, but they don't directly follow it. Sorry, I went backwards there. You're like, that looks familiar. What is that? Well, it's because I went backwards. Okay, so then when we're done, we have our minimum, our midpoint, and our max. And so these numbers are not right, okay? So don't go back and take these. They're not right. I left them that way on purpose. So let's say down here on the bottom, okay, let's say this human resources rep. Let's say that I wanted them to have a college degree and 2 to 5 years of experience and maybe a certification. So they would actually be a lot higher grade job if I wanted that. So let's kind of put them down into 13, only because with all that they might have gone into 14, but we can't see 14 on the screen. So let's look down at these numbers at the very bottom down here and say, okay, if I wanted somebody with a college degree and a certification and 2 to 5 years of experience, then the midpoint would be 3611. And okay, well, let's say somebody comes in and you like them and they don't have 2 years of experience and they only have they didn't graduate from college. In fact, they never even got to the major part of it. They only had a couple years of the you know, general education part, and they would like to sit for their certification, but they haven't. Well, let me ask you this. Do you go out on a car lot and pay for a V8 engine and a sport package and drive off in a 4-cylinder with nothing package on it? No. Well, you know, when you go onto the internet and you look at the car that you'd like and you add things like floor mats and tires and the price goes up in the upper corner, well, that's kind of the same thing. When you added on that college degree, you added on a V8 to the 4-cylinder. Actually, you probably put a V6. Master's degree would have been the V8. And when you wanted the certification, you'd put on the sport package. And when you wanted the 2 years versus the up to 2 years of experience, well, maybe you put on some, maybe you put in some floor mats or what have you. That always cracks me up. Floor mats, and the price goes up. So you don't pay midpoint if they don't have that. So we'd probably start that person down at 28.88, the minimum, because they don't have it. But I'm going to show you how in this merit increase budget coming up, there's something called position in range factor that will actually catch this person up as they get the experience and if they decide to go to college and whatnot as they go along. So they won't always be lagging behind the fact. Now, somebody who might be in the job 10, 15 years is making the $43. But, you know, once again, is it, 1 year of experience 10, 15 times over, or is it 15 years of experience? If you're doing the same job and you're, maybe you've branched out and what have you, but if you're still just handling the same paperwork, then you're just doing the same job. And there needs to be a reason. Somebody one time had a mortgage loan processor that was making 156% comp ratio. That's $1,560 on a $10 job. I said, what's up with that? They said she does twice as much as anybody else and she makes no errors. I said, how do you know? We have productivity software. Okay, well then that's a bargain, isn't it? You're paying 1.5 times the wage rate and 1 set of benefits and you're getting 2 times the productivity. Good reason. But if somebody else had a $26 teller on which at the time almost was a $10 pay scale in that area, and I said, what's up with that? They said she has 20 years of experience. I said, no, what she has is 21 year of experience 20 times over. I said, because of the fact that you're a credit union, and your group that formed you were union auto workers, they pay for time, back to the seniority, but you're not. You're a financial institution. That's not. So we need to change some of these things. So what should determine your pay increases is the market price for labor, your business's performance, and then a factor for individual performance, such as our 156% comp ratio mortgage loan officer. Now, this is what's called a merit increase budget. Some people call it a salary budget. Finance loves these things. Well, they love it because it puts a method on the madness. So if you, on this matrix, if you look on the left, that's performance levels. If you look across the top, don't look at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s. It'll just confuse you. Look at these numbers, these percentages. Those are your comp ratios. Look at those. Okay? And so then you go down and you set some assumptions. And on this one, we set, and I only did it this way so the numbers would pop out at you. 3% for base merit increase. That's the price. That's the price that labor has moved. And 2% for performance, and then 2% for position and range, that catch-up or lag-up factor I was talking to you about. And this would probably really, if you were really doing this, be 2% base merit increase and 3 or 4% for performance. And you don't want to leave out that position and range, because if you do, what's going to happen is people who you hired below the market are never going to catch up, and people who are above the market are just going to keep spiraling, and you're going to wind up with a $26 an hour teller. Okay, so look at the circle here. That, if you look at the comp ratio up there, and we're just going to blow through this, and it looks kind of a lot of numbers and what have you, but I promise you that if you look at this and go back, you will eventually go, oh, that makes sense. So if we look at this circle 3, they're in the market. They're in 97 to 103%. Whatever they're paid, it is between 97 to 103% of the midpoint, and they are meeting expectations. So they get the base merit increase. You might hear some people say average raise for average work for average pay. There you go, right there. Right above that circled 3, if you notice that 4% is still in the same market range, the comp ratio is, but they're doing a better job. They're exceeding expectations. Now, so what happens was this 2% for performance, it got divided in half. So see, now you see why I'm using 2, because otherwise we'd have half percentages and what have you. So 2% for performance gets divided in half, gets added on to 3, 4%. And the person who's far exceeding gets up at the very top, blue arrow from the left, gets the whole 2% for performance. 3 plus 2 is 5. All right. Now we have to put in this position and range factor. So if you look to the left of the 5%, notice I got 2% for position and range. I've got 2 groups that are below market, one more than the other. So for the one that's just a little bit below market, I divide my 2% in half. I added on to that 5, 3 plus 2 plus 1 makes 6. The person over to the left, if you look at that, they're far exceeding expectations, and they're making 910, less than 910 on my $10 scale. So they get 3% for base, 2% for performance, and the whole 2% for position and range to catch them up. They make 7. All right, now let's go back to our 5 at the top, which has got the blue arrow coming in from the left. Look over here to this first green arrow to your right. Now you can see the position and range factor is being used to slow people down. It's divided, you got two sections above market, 2% divided in half is 1, and so it takes away on the first green arrow 1%, and on the second green arrow, it takes away 2%. Now the reality is you probably wouldn't start taking people away if they're making great, you probably, usually you take that 2% away if they're making like 120%. But, or what you can do is on the right side, especially for those people who are exceeding and far exceeding or meeting expectations, you take the 2%, you take that 2% position and range factor out of the equation, and so you would, for this first green arrow to the left, you would actually give that person a 5% increase. But let's say if they were 120% above, you don't want to just keep spiraling, right? So you give them a 5%, you give them a 5% increase, which is the highest you can get for merit and performance here. And but you don't increase their base rate. It's given to them in what's called a lump sum bonus. All right, so moving along here, it looks great. You can make some mistakes if you have an overdependence on job descriptions and they are inaccurate, as a lot of places are. You choose the wrong ranking for internal equity. You try to squeeze in too many or too little grades. You're trying to put different grades where there's really not much differentiation between jobs, like a teller ranking 4, 5, and 6, but they basically all do the same thing. And that will cause you to probably have pay compression as well. You had bad numbers for your external equity. You know, if you're like, say, a college, you know, you have to have numbers, you have to have salary data for the people that actually run the college, and then you have a different set of numbers which are completely comprised differently for people like your professors. So you end up with, you have to have two systems. You can't just have by one. So you know, so that's kind of like a very extreme, because it's like you got two different businesses running there. Or you don't know what it is you want to reward, you have no compensation philosophy, and you don't have to be the sharpest saw in the shed to look back and say, well, you could play that pretty good if you could game the system pretty well if you were a manager. Because if salary budget increases this year, that 3% now is like 1, and your employees are used to getting more, then you just bump them up to a higher performance level. And that's why we say there needs to be some overview and calibration of the merit ranking. With variable pay, you're going to have, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, so base salary compression, generally defined as where the differences in pay are so small they're considered inequitable. There's some examples there. You know, like places where non-exempt subordinates make a lot of overtime, then they end up making as much or sometimes more than their supervisors do. Often it comes into fact with new hire salaries are almost the same as existing employees in the same job, but just because you've been in the job for a long time, you know, yes, experience counts, but these days sometimes you might have worked there 20 years, but it's really just the last 5 years that you know that's important. However, you do have to, you know, you're not going to retain people if you don't reward some loyalty, right? So what usually happens is maybe you've never determined your internal equity correctly. There was no oversight of your open range system, meaning that people were just hiring where they wanted to in the range, minimum, mid, max. Or there was no oversight of the merit increase system. Or somebody wasn't watching the numbers, but more often than not, if they were watching the numbers and it happened, they were watching bad data. Because if it's not a numbers problem, then it's a management problem. Because, you know, it's kind of, these things get out of hand, and then it takes a lot of money to fix them, and then who wants to be the person who shows up with the kill the messenger proposal? It's gonna cause this much. Well, nobody's screaming mourning, you know, occasionally, somebody yells about yeah, well, you know, if you want to fix it, then this is what it's going to cost. And the most common reason base salary compression happens is no one wanted to grab hold of the problem. I said before, there are often different ranking systems. We use the point factor ranking, which is the most common, but these are some different ones you can use. Pay grade step progression, you see that in the public sector. In the federal sector, they have pay grades, but there's progressions and steps within each, you know, the minimum, the mid, and the max. And sometimes you don't even need anyone's approval. If you just meet the requirements of the next step, your pay automatically goes up. That would be nice, right? You don't have to fight with anybody. Some places like law firms, they'll have a lot of different grades because it's a status thing. It's not a compensation thing. Broadbanding can help sometimes because you have fewer but broader ranges. So sometimes there's a good reason for that. So basically, if you've got grades 4, 5, and 6. This would help with our teller problem. You got grades 4, 5, and 6. Instead of making a teller 4, 5, and 6, where it's basically doing the same job, you can do broadbanding, and so that would mean that you could pay a teller anywhere from the minimum of 4 up to the maximum on grade 6. And so you'd have more room to move people around in there. All right, variable pay. Let's talk about that. We already said it supports the organization's strategic direction and drives the accomplishment of organizational goals by enabling you to recognize and reward high performers and to sustain low performance. And to sustain high performance, I'm sorry. You know who hates variable pay? Low performers. You know who loves it? High performers, because it moves up and down with their results, which should be driven by your business results. The idea is to align the focus of the employee with enterprise-wide goals, and it pays for itself. And average performance is already compensated for in the base pay at the market rate. However, you know, it doesn't negate the need to compete in the market with base pay for good employees, and some incentive pay isn't applicable to every position. So, for example, well, I'll give you some examples later on. And then the sad part about variable pay is it rewards outcomes. It doesn't reward good tries. Like, you don't get a commission for almost selling a car. And one of the biggest challenge on the company side is how do you set up and put into place mechanisms to measure performance and its profitability before you find out that you rewarded the wrong thing that has no payoff, along with the lost opportunities of what they could have been doing. And that's why modeling is so important. If we did this, then what would happen? So short-term incentive pay is meant to reward performance over a period of 1 year or less. Long-term incentive pay are for your executives, meant to align outcomes and reward performance over a period longer than 1 year. Stock options is probably the most obvious example of that. Variable pay can incentivize average performers to improve. It can incentivize low performers to go elsewhere, such as the car lot. You're going to starve to death if you can't sell cars. But you throw a really good commission onto somebody that likes to sell, and that's like throwing gas on a bonfire. They'll be selling cars and it'll be paying for itself, right? And if you're a kind of on the line car salesperson, you're going to try harder, right? So variable pay has to have a supportive process, buy-in and commitment from management, clear goals, so that I'm like a greyhound running down a track with that stuffed rabbit right in front of me. Clear goals, and then proper rewards, appropriate rewards, enough that I will actually try to go out and get it. Okay, so kind of a copy. Sorry, I thought I had 90 minutes. I actually have 60, so. Let's talk about linking your reward system with your performance management system. In a perfect world, here's how it would start. You would have company plans and goals. Your 2020 or your 2019 December performance reviews, you would have sat down with your employees and said, okay, 2019's over, let's talk about 2020. Because you would have talked about 2019 while it was happening. There's no reason. That toothpaste is out of the tube. No reason to talk about 2019 in December. Talk about 2020. And in your job, here are some goals that we're going to set for you. Now, those goals could be job goals, which are related to the job and applicable to everybody. Things that expand upon the job description. Remember, expand is the key word here. And so more than is expected by the job description. And you could have some, maybe some project goals. We're going to look at a project goal here that's going to apply to everybody in my fake bank, which is a car sale. And so it'll be a goal, but that goal will actually be paid with a commission check because it's something that's gonna apply to the bottom line of the bank. And then there are other goals that for a lot of people are gonna, in our examples, are gonna also be reflected in that merit increase budget. And then we can also have goals that our supervisor sets for us, and personal goals. Maybe our HR rep wants to go back to college and so we set a goal of the classes they'll take and the grades that they'll get, or we can put cross-training goals in supervisors or personal goals. Learn so-and-so's job by such and such a day. Teach your job to so-and-so by such and such a date. So there can be goals in here that would be reflected in the merit increase budget, and goals that would be reflected as incentives as well. And then we might have some competencies. And competencies are, for example, we want our manager to improve their leadership skills. And competencies are going to be there, and if they do that, that's going to be reflected in that merit budget increase. Okay, now, so we're going to have some clear measures, and they're going to be forward-looking, and we're going to have to communicate, and then we're going to have appropriate rewards. So on that car sale that I mentioned, that, I always say incentives, which are, for revenue, they start with spreadsheets. Like, how many cars did we sell last year? How many do we want to sell this year? What's the profit that we're going to get? How much are we willing to turn back to the employees? And then we're going to see something called gap insurance that's very lucrative to financial institutions. And we really want them to sell that. How much profit would we get off that? How much are we willing to turn back to the employees? And that's going to determine how we set up this balanced scorecard project goal. It's a project goal, but the term balanced scorecard really just means that no side can exceed, no job title can have success at the expense of another job title or the project, as you'll see on the next slide. So the company goal in our strategic plan, it says we want to increase sales of autos by 10% over last year at the summer auto sale. And our project goal that's going to apply to all these job titles on the right is we want to increase sales of gap insurance, and that's going to be 10% over last year. Okay, so how are we going to do this for these people? So our VP of marketing needs to create some type of advertising campaign that's going to get more feet on the lot. Okay, just more feet there, more people that could possibly sell a car. And then our VP of Finance is going to create packages of auto financing for all credit scores, so for which 95% of those people on the lot that we call potential buyers will qualify if they want to buy a car. Our Director of Training is going to create a sales training program for which all employers are going to pass with an 85% proficiency rate. Our Director of HR is going to hire a temporary labor force. However, you can't just hire anybody. They have to pass that sales course at 85% proficiency, and they're going to have to meet 85% of their sales goals for my Director of HR to get their project goal met. My branch manager is going to have to cross-train all these people to sell gap insurance, and they're going to sell it. So it results in a 10% increase on all auto sales and a 10% increase in gap on the loans. That's kind of redundant there. Gap is added to the auto sale loan. Gap insurance is if you buy like a $70,000 truck and you drive it off the lot and you get T-boned and your truck is now worth $50,000 but the loan is still $70,000, that's gap insurance. If you buy expensive cars, you probably want it actually. If you drive a car like I do, you don't really need it so much. There's not really a gap. I'm knocking on wood here. So suspicious. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's a very lucrative product for financial institutions. Make a lot of money on it. Now, our loan officer needs to finance 95% of those auto loans at the annual auto sale using this package of auto financing that the VP of Finance has put together. But we want them to apply the right loan. They're the right loan to the right person. So they can't have more than a 3% charge-off rate on these loans, because we want loans, but we want people to pay them back. Now, our MSRs and our tellers, you can tell that I have a total of member service reps and tellers, so I have 10 of them, because they're all supposed to sell 10% of car volume, 60% of their sales closed with gap insurance. So variable pay, honestly, your goals and a lot of the things that you need, the information is not compensation data. It's not in HR. It's, generally held in most companies by finance and operations. They're the ones that have the information. Finance and ops are the ones that have the information about the profitability of GAAP and all that kind of stuff. So you need some cross-department cooperation. So how would this look? Okay, so notice that if I'm, if I'm a teller, I had my goals set for me in December of 2019. I had some job goals, I had some supervisor goals, I had some personal goals, and then my group goal is actually a project, and I'm gonna, and so while all these other things that are in gray at the top left are going to be reflected, and my competencies are going to be reflected because the competencies are actually put into my personal goals. Those are going to be reflected in that merit increase budget. But this group, this auto sale, that's a revenue. So I'm going to get a commission check for that in a bonus. All right, now if I'm a branch manager, then I've got the same thing going on, but I also get a sales commission for what the people who work for me sold, those tellers and those MSRs. So they're going to get a sales commission for anything they sold, but also for the MSRs and the tellers that work for them. They're going to get a commission for that as well. And so that's how you can have like a compensation. So you can have because it's true of most jobs, unless you're just a salesperson on a car lot, and even then there's usually some type of merit increase factor for like, how well they exemplify, and get along with their coworkers and that thing. All right, so incentives, that car lot sale that we just went through, those would be examples of incentives. They're compensation tied directly to the level as results were achieved. If I'm an MSR and I don't sell my cars and I don't sell my GAAP, I don't get my check. I get a little check, but at the end of the year, I actually don't meet my goal because of the fact that I didn't meet my financial accomplishments. So incentives add to bottom line profitability, and they control costs. And as we said before, they can incentivize average performers to improve, incentivize low performers to go elsewhere. They raise the bar for the entire organization. So what could go wrong? I'm almost done. What could go wrong? The most common thing I see go wrong is people sitting around thinking, what do you think we can incentivize? We need to incentivize these employees. And so then no one ever really asks, what do you mean by the term incentivize? And so we're just sitting around going, okay, what could we pay employees for if they did some things? And what things could they do that we could pay them for? And so they start thinking, well, let's pay this teller for balancing or accuracy. Oh, no way. That's in the job description. That's you have to balance and you have to be accurate. Teller is a cash handling job. If you can't keep a hold of the cash, it doesn't matter if you lost it, you ate it, you gave it away, or what you stole it. You can't you can't keep hold of it. A receptionist, well, they route the calls correctly. Well, isn't that the whole purpose of having them there? No, we're not going to incentivize that. What about accounting, back office, closing the books on time? You have to have them closed on time. This is a done deal. That's why we have these people. So no, you don't incentivize that kind of thing. Another common mistake, people just sit around and say, well, what do you think it's worth? What do you think selling a car is worth? What do you think selling gap insurance is worth? $5, $10? What? No, that starts with a spreadsheet. So just some other main examples. These other two are kind of just outliers, so we're not going to go through those incentives in time. But I would say, because we've got more important fish to fry, incentives do not make up for mistakes in hiring fit. I had a friend who took care of my horses for a long time, and her kids sold all kinds of things. And the youngest son was never going to make a salesperson. The middle son, you could not stop that kid from selling. And the oldest son, he did a good job. So the youngest son was just perfectly adorable and had all these kinds of talents and things too, but he was never going to make a salesperson. It's not going to make up for a mistake in hiring fit. Incentives also don't make up for poor supervision and group dysfunction. And, you know, all businesses change. I don't care if you're a gravel pit. There are certain times of the year that some gravel is more profitable. So as your business changes, so should your incentives, because remember, those incentives are supposed to drive results, not be something that you can just pay your employees. Incentives are carriers of momentum, not drivers of productivity. The young son's not going to be a salesperson. The middle son's going to sell no matter what. But if you give them a good commission, woo, there's that gas on the fire, carrier of momentum. And remember, whatever you reward or notice, you're going to get more of that and less of something else. So I can guarantee you that in August at that bank, they're going to be paying attention to car sales, car sales, car sales. All right, pay at risk is the idea of lowering a base rate because they're going to make up for it in incentives. And so you only do that for you only do that for revenue jobs, sales and production, because they're the only ones that really have that ability to make up for it. So that's what happens at a car lot, that car salesperson's pay is actually below often what they might make as a teller at a bank. But boy, they can make a lot of money selling cars. So it becomes, that actually works for car lots. Because if you can sell cars, which is why they want you, you're going to stay there. If you can't, you are going to go over to the bank and get another job. All right, just a few things here in regs that I want to talk about. Probably the one that is usually most surprising to people is this one. Remember, the Fair Labor Standards Act is, overtime versus no overtime. So if you are not exempt from the overtime requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act, you are a non-exempt worker. And if you are exempt, meaning you meet that three-part test, you're exempt from the overtime requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act. That's where that terminology comes for. But it's a really old law, 1938. And so they never really, at the time, people made their money working, kind of blue-collar jobs primarily. Didn't have a lot of what they called exempt workers. And so they'd never really thought about incentives and those kind of things. So it's an old law, but it doesn't really reflect 2020 employers' needs, but it's all we got, right? So you have to deal with it. Now, there are what they call non-discretionary versus discretionary incentive payments. That's their language. So basically, non-discretionary means if you do this, they get that. It's a form of fixed compensation promised to the employee to induce them to do something, verbally or in writing. I will give you a bonus for meeting these production goals. It could even be something that they come up and say, I'll give you $100 cash at the end of the day if you meet today's production goals. Or it could be a formalized program that says if you meet production goals for the next 6 months, here's how. Do this, get that. Or it could be promised for anything. Retention bonuses during a layoff. It could be what we're going to look at, an attendance bonus. And so basically what happens is, we're going to see on the next page, it changes my wage rate. And so any overtime that I earned during that period, any overtime I worked during that period has to be recalculated at the new wage rate that incentive bonus changed it to. I'll give you an example on the next page. Discretionary bonuses are, on the other hand, man, we met the production goals today. I didn't think we'd do it. Here's $100. Woohoo! I had no expectation of getting that. It was at the employer's sole discretion and not in accordance with any pre-announced standards. So, for example, every year are we going to get a holiday bonus? I don't know. Well, they don't want you to count on that. They want to make it a discretionary bonus. These spot rewards that employers have, those are discretionary bonuses. They give them out however they want usually. All right, but let's say we give an attendance bonus at our company that offers an employee a $1 an hour bonus for every hour worked in a day in which they meet all time and attendance obligations. Obviously, we have an attendance problem. So Sally makes $10 an hour, but she works $45 that week and makes a $45 attendance bonus. But her overtime was calculated on her making $10 an hour. But I would ask you, isn't 1.5 times $10 an hour less? Because that's the overtime rate. 1.5 times your base wage rate. So isn't 1.5 times $10 an hour less than what she would make if you added $45 to her base pay rate, which, if my math is correct in all this, takes it to $11.13. And the overtime rate of 15 which is what the $10 would be, is now $16.69. So we owe Sally an overtime adjustment of $8.44. And, if she does that every week for 52 weeks, that's a lot of money, especially when you're making $10 an hour. That's something supervisors don't seem to realize, They're making $40 an hour. They don't think, oh, that's not worth anything. That's just a Starbucks. Yeah, well, 52 times 52 weeks, $10 an hour, I'd file a Department of Labor claim on you too. But what if I just show up one day and give Sally a $45 gift card that she never expected for good attendance? Yeah, well, that's a discretionary bonus. All right, just the last couple slides here. A job's worth is a job's worth. I think you can kind of see, remember that report I showed you where we looked at the project director versus the VP of services? Well, there's something called an internal equity review that you do in a compensation system. And if you go in there and you see that you've got 2 mortgage loan processors that were hired a year ago making a few thousand more than women who have been in the same job who are also mortgage loan processors. And mortgage loan processor is a job that really doesn't require any education past high school because you learn it on the job. It's detail and accuracy and a lot of regulations that they don't teach in any school. So it's a job that you learn through experience. And so why are the men making more? Well, you go to the CEO and you say, hey, this is point these things out to you, not making any judgments, but the men are hired in a year ago and they're making several thousand more than the women who've both been here 10 years. Seriously, it was 2 men and 2 women. It was 10 years. It was $5,000. So, and you point out that, and the CEO says, well, the men have skills that the women don't have. And I say, okay. I say, because, I believe them. I don't know. And I say, but are they using those skills currently? Because the Equal Pay Act requires that employers must pay equal pay wages to women and men in the same establishment for performing substantially equal work. So unless you're actually using those skills right now, they're performing substantially equal work. And your internal equity, that report is documentation that shows that they are, right? And so he says, well, I have plans for them. And I said, okay. I said, well, then the thing would be to pay them that extra money when they're actually carrying out your plans. So you can bring the women up. I can't tell you what to do. I can just tell you this is the things you hired me to point out to you. So because the Equal Pay Act does require that. And it's not just wages, it's all forms of pay, as you can see in the second bullet. And unequal compensation can be justified only if the employer shows its pay differentials attributable to a fair seniority, merit, or incentive system. So as I pointed out to him, I said, you say that, but the women could actually use this internal equity report as a way to make a pretty good case that they're doing the same things as the men and they're making less money for doing it. There are also state laws, such as California has its own Equal Pay Act, and then it has a lot of other laws in regards to, say, trying to combat systemic discrimination in wages, like we referred to earlier. And there's last time I looked, there's about 26 states that do have some form of law trying to prohibit systemic discrimination in wage rates, in all different kinds of ways. Okay, now. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits employers with at least 15 workers from discriminating against their employees on the basis of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in all terms and conditions of employment, including pay. Title VII also prohibits pay discrimination that results from steering women into lower paying jobs, unfairly denying them promotion, and other forms of discrimination that can impact pay. And also that in regards to its other protected classes. Now, there's a couple types of ways you can discriminate. You can discriminate just singularly, or you could have what they call systemic discrimination, that you don't intend to discriminate, but your practices or procedures or policies have the effect of creating that. Lily Ledbetter was a real person, and she found out after she left her job that she had been there was pay discrimination occurring, and so she sued her employer, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, who said, well, be that as it may, really all we can say is, you know, you lose because you missed the statute of limitations. So the Supreme Court, being the highest court in the land, if the current administration wants to change the effects of a Supreme Court decision, they have to write a new law to override it. And so during the Obama administration, that's exactly what they did. They wrote the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. And so what it does, it clarifies that each paycheck containing discriminatory compensation is actionable under Title VII. It basically, every time you get the paycheck, it resets the statute of limitations. Executive Order 11246 is often what people call, nicknamed the affirmative action law, because what it does, it prohibits federal contractors, federally assisted construction contractors, and federal subcontractors from discriminating in employment decisions. And you have to have a plan when your entity's contract or subcontracts exceed 10,000. They call those affirmative action plans. You can be a small employer and maybe, say, sign a contract with Boeing and make yourself subject to affirmative action, not because you would be under this definition, but because you contractually obligated yourself. The National Labor Relations Act was a very old law, 1935. Back then there was nothing, no Title VII, no OSHA, no Fair Labor Standards Act. And so basically the only protection employees had against their employer treating them badly was to band together. And so the National Labor Relations Act protects the rights of most private sector employees to join together with or without a union to improve their wages and working conditions. And so in the 7th section, it gives employees the right to discuss their all their working conditions, wages, safety, everything, even supervision. And so they call them Section 7 rights. And so you don't have to, and so a lot of people think this doesn't apply to me if I don't have a union. No, they can band together. They don't have to have a union. They just have a group. It's the idea of collectivism. And then also don't forget state laws that you have in regards to other types of discrimination. Title VII, the Age Discrimination Employment Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibit compensation discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, or disability. Unlike the Equal Pay Act, there's no requirement under Title VII, the Age Discrimination Act, or the Americans with Disabilities Act that the jobs must be substantially equal. These are actually two really good guides for you there on those links. The Office of Contracts Compliance Programs, which is actually part of the Department of Labor, was created to assist in enforcing Executive Order 11246. So when you hear affirmative action employers say they're being audited, that's who they're being audited by, which can either be a full-blown audit or more likely is a desk audit. And so this, they were enacted to ensure that companies doing business with the federal government don't engage in those discriminatory practices. And so they are interested in a couple things, priorities, if you will, systemic discrimination, and also in discrimination in regards to veterans and individuals with disabilities. And so Amazon and Google aren't the only ones that have big data these days. So does the government, and they have interagency cooperation. And so active case enforcement allows them to focus more aggressively on examination and dissection of employment data, and coordination of enforcement efforts and sharing of information regarding discrimination claims under Title VII and Executive Order 11246. So if they come in and audit and they see something in there that could violate Title VII, interagency cooperation, they'd probably tip them off.